Chapter 1 Radiant City. In this room, decorated with the color of black, a seeping desolation in which was so dark, accompanied by a putrid smell, as if all the habitats of animals had been deceased inside the hollow shell for more time than would seem fit. The only source of visible luminance that the room gave came from a petite television set, an old rabbit television that had been left on the ground, dusted and cloudy.
"Hello, citizens of Radiant City,"
said a distorted voice, although through the distortion and scratching noise coming through the flashing television, his voice was quite charming and endearing, transfixed on the audience he was speaking to.
"My name is John Flystark,"
he would say blaringly.
"And today on Radiant Central we have a potential assassination attempt on Mayor Kerrigan. After an exclusive interview with Mayor Kerrigan, we have learned that the anonymous assassin named Bullet may have had something to do with this grueling assassination attempt, and currently is the primary suspect."
His voice would seemingly decrease in pitch, and the moving picture soon took to a still image of him, and one singular hand gesture having everything else being frozen momentarily. If his voice was twisted and misrepresented before, it amplified as the moving pictures soon turned to erratic and melting static, while the brick-paved walls behind the rabbit television were now simply rubble and untainted stonework. And from this scattered rubble rose a costumed man, only painted with the colors one would see on a gravel road, who even upon this was experiencing the sheer difficulties even from lifting himself up from the dusty ground, which hadn't changed much from its already uncomfortable state. Out of the ghastly circumstances did another, almost identical man stumble through the strangling smoke that had been created from the large round and quite unplanned decoration in the wall, like that one Christmas present you didn't want. If the present was a hole. The hand of leather reached for him as his fabrication was snatched, and so was he, while the arm would toss him into the ominous outside. The knight was nearly as young as the attacker, who wore the inordinate amount of technology, whose hair was ragged and a greasy mess of near blackness of tints and browns, his eyes being covered by the foggy goggles layered with debris. "I guess not a warm unwelcoming for family reunion, just a bloodbath for two," said the attacker, an open palm laid on his just as bruised and crimson opening, his stomach, which had been oozing red liquid, or for the sake of transparency, would ooze thick blood. In all the names in the world in which you would think of, you wouldn't think that these two men possessed the simplest of ones, such as Alexander and Gabriel. Gabriel was the one who wore the yellow and black. His brown and shorter hair was messy and unkempt from the impactful blow through the thin-layered wall, and getting to his feet while simultaneously trying to fix his speed regulator that was in spasm and frenzy on his chest proved to be challenge. Small and yellow bolts of deadening lightning came from his breastbone at an astounding speed, testing the mere phylogenetic structure of the weathering clouds. This runner would call on the only track that he could endure, which was further down the alleyway to where he knew he would be able to get his hands on any form of electronic pulses through the active power vents. He crawled and crawled at a speed that would seem alien to him, as the man who played the role of the attacker and his brother would stretch forth his forearm, which was layered with buttons and lights of neon. All it took was a few presses and commands, and the power vents lost their blue glow, while all that track runner could do was gasp with disappointment with the twin that stood behind him, like an injured beast out of its cage, aspects and facial expressions that resembled a triumphant glee. He would simply cock his gun, aiming it at his own mirrored reflection. A sharp ring filled the ears of Track Runner, the trigger of the gun being pulled all too late as a woman came to his aid, shoving the attacker into the parts of the wall that still remained stern and parted with the concrete that began to crumble with each aggressive smash. Alexander's head began to bleed the same red substance that occurred through the crevices of his brother's torn skin. It matched his new enemy's clothing, while his morals bounded him from fighting back, until it seemed there was a fourth party in the round. A robotic-structured hand would viciously grab the girl's crimson blood hair and yank her back with a vengeance. A small blood-curdling chuckle left Alexander's lips, while behind him bared floating enemies that clinched onto this young man, like a disease less potent to kill, but more assist. The plasticity of the android was clear, her having no real skin or flesh, just a great clogging of metal scraps and bolts that formed the basis of her outline. "I've upgraded. And in that operation of different little helpers did I truly understand who I was in this mundane city. I'm an architectural genius, brother!" exclaimed Alexander, forming an uttering yell. "Monologues aren't really my thing, so I'll spare you from any more of my repetition," he responded to his own second act of his Shakespearean ramblings, all while his opposition was still clinging onto the light of his life. "You're so sure of yourself," said the lesser brethren, still rendering a lower position on the ground. "I mean, we both know that your biggest downfall, the one thing that prevents you from being able to reign supreme, the one thing that holds you back—" Gabriel stopped, letting a red cough escape through and on his lips. "Is one simple thing," said Gabriel. His words were synthesized by his wet and clogged gurgling. "And what's that, big bro?" asked the almost naive younger brother, as Gabriel turned his neck, the neck that was orchestrated with cracks and creaks that overlapped the same cracking and creaking that hollowed the crumbling buildings around them. "You always assume that this fight is simply just between you and me," said Gabriel as he rendered a red smile. Alexander's face turned from a blank confidence and a mere look of confusion. His face was riddled with unseen quintessential fatigue. The fatigue that was painted onto his face was soon a trembling look of trepidation, hearing the all-too-familiar sound of clots mashing together. Gabriel, too, although he held the face of credence, he too was befuddled at his own integration of anything less than temptation as a destabilizing light seeped through the crooked crevices of the broken walls and scattered roof tilings. Unusually, the light had no source that could be seen, only an unorthodox outline of a man, apparent from his structured physique. In a second that seemed less so, a single shining credence ripped through the fabric of reality and snatched onto the same fabric that covered Alexander's body, lifting him up with the string of ease. What stared back at Alexander was something almost out of this world in appearance. Bright yellow eyes seeped through his soul. The prevailed good and nothing but the voice of silence, while the tentacles that binded him released a golden vapor that turned Alexander's grasp on reality, somewhat of an exposition of blurred vision. A subatomic state was what Alexander was currently in, as his eyes cried a red liquid mixed with fluids he had become foreign to. "Alex!" Gabriel cried. The extent of what had become expected far exceeded his harmless intent, and the worst was yet to come as the cybernetic humanoid spoke.
"Gabriel Ellison King, you and your brother are under arrest for arson, damage of personal property, and attempted murder. Come quietly, and you will be spared of any inconvenience alongside your arrest. Anything you say may be used against you in the court of law. Resist and it may lead to permanent consequences," said the filtered voice of Class 133, Model 560. Yet the cords that strung him together were suddenly blackened and gained for no use as his fusion core was pulled from its base. The stringent arm that held up Alexander released its viper grip. "Are you all right?" Gabriel would ask, keeping a cautionary distance away from his secondary enemy. "What was that?" Alexander asked. He too was keeping his distance from his brother, his eyebrows furrowed in confusion and anger, while the 7-foot behemoth stood blank-faced and yellow, outlines offline.
"It's one of those officer-bought things," Gabriel replied, unsure also about the architectural design that laid before him. It was huge, bigger than both of them combined. An absurdist would believe it could be beaten by two mere civilians, and yet there it was on the gravelly rooftop with nothing but its limp, mandatory ligaments. "This wouldn't have happened if you'd just stayed out of my way," said Alexander, with such a childish attitude. You'd think there was nothing but an overwhelmingly molded child, spoiled to the core of his roots. "If I hadn't intervened, people would have died. You nearly got me killed," said Gabriel, trying to crack through Alexander's wall of naivety. "I had it under control," said Alexander, blinding by the literal and metaphorical smoke that clouded his eyes. "You need to get out of here before Valentine shows up," Gabriel said, arching his hands on his narrower hips. "Blah, blah, blah. I'll be fine. You needn't have to worry about me." "Don't you fear, brother," Alexander said, placing his unshaken hand onto his taller self's shoulder, contradicting the prior displays of physical contact. Truly a flourishing amount of condescension from his forever younger brother, making the roles in which their bloodlines chose to twist and bend. Alexander stopped as he let his arm drop, a smile sneaking through his lining dimples. "You know me. I'm Game Boy," he said, wiping the crimson paint from his still recovering face as his sides were being partnered with his steam-filled companion. His little android helpers clipped the fabric on his clothing as he gave a tiny wave before chuckling his arrogant-filled chuckle. Gabriel watched his younger brother fade into the firelit clouds before hearing the repetitive breathing, shallow and rapid breathing from the Chief Inspector Hartwell Valentine, clapping his hands onto his knees as he tried desperately to catch the breath he was rapidly losing. "Oh, crap," said Hartwell. His voice was mutable and muffled through the movement-deprived mouth. He had a beard that was crafted to fit his metallic face and his yellow glowing eyes. "I thought I told you not to hurt him, or me," said Gabriel, shedding no eye contact with the inspector, gazing into the ignited and smoke-infected clouds. "I thought I told you to be discreet, the way I'm seeing it," Hartwell said as he turned to see the colors of red mixing together from the style of brick to the drips of blood, and then the fire. "Why that thing was made is beyond me. I told you from the start I could handle Alexander," Gabriel remarked, his eyebrows burrowing with the folds of his skin. He placed his hand on the leather straps on his mask, removing the fusion bindings that kept his costume together. What happened to, your girlfriend?" asked the chief of police. His eyes were disingenuous, while Gabriel's turned glassy, turning his head towards the tenderloin of the rubble. She was barely slit, nor was she harmed, which allowed Gabriel to exhale outwards, his expediting concern into which he was being carried throughout his chest, seeing his love unscathed. "You should leave," said the chief of police, as the consistent sound of moving sirens began to increase in the distance from the two.